Now we are spot on time for the panel discussion forum, and I will share my screen to present the members of our panel to you. So I'm happy to have to present to you the experts that will contribute and participate in our discussion forum. We have Lesley Stubbings, who works at LSCC Limited, and she's a member and participant of SCOPS and an independent sheep consultant in the UK. Welcome. We also have Katarina Gustafsson, who is a sheep consultant at Farm and Animal Health in Sweden. Ewin Wauters is a senior researcher at the Flemish Institute for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, and he's a project coordinator of the Disarm project on antibiotic resistance. He's from Belgium. And last but not least, we have Dave Bartley, the co-chair of Working Group 2 and a senior researcher at the Modern Research Institute in the UK. I would like, I'll stop sharing my screen. I would like to start. Well, for those of you that weren't here yesterday, the format of our discussion forum is different from what you might expect in a live conference, because due to the limited time, the concept of this discussion is more a webinar concept rather than an open discussion with the audience. However, do feel free to ask your questions in the Mentimeter. We'll first address some questions that were sent in advance, and if we have still time at the end, we will address then the questions that were asked in the Mentimeter forum and that received most votes. So don't feel disappointed too much if your questions will not be addressed in the forum, because we will address them afterwards and you will get a response to your question. I can promise that. I would like to ask the first question to Lesley Stubbings, please. What can we expect from communication to promote sustainable worm control, and what else is needed?
Thank you, Edmund, and thank you for inviting me to this panel today. It's been very interesting listening to the papers, because I think in answer to that, Fiona van der Veld's paper really highlighted the fact that with Northern and Central Europe, the threat of anthelmintic resistance itself is not a real influencer in terms of uptake. So what I'd like to suggest really is that the sort of area that we're going to be concentrating on now is to move away from, if you like, the threat of anthelmintic resistance, i.e. the problem, and moving towards the solution, which is the uptake of sustainable practices. Our farmers don't, as we know, the awareness of anthelmintic resistance is now very high, but the threat of that is not enough to change their attitudes and to change what they're actually doing. We're asking them to make a quantum leap at times from practices that have been deeply ingrained, and indeed we as the scientific and veterinary community have encouraged them in the past to do. And so it's a confidence building thing that we need to do. And so we're moving more towards looking at the benefits of sustainable control, of which one of the side benefits is that we will be taking the pressure off anthelmintics. For example, the benefits of targeted selective treatments with the project, I think Fiona Kenyon's on there today, where we're looking at developing the TST algorithm within our Smart Sheep project to not just give benefits in terms of reduced anthelmintics, but benefits in terms of actual animal performance as well. So I think it's this moving away from telling farmers what to do and, if you like, beating them up with anthelmintic resistance as a problem, more to trying to communicate to them the benefits of a more holistic, sustainable control.
Okay, that's interesting, because there was a similar question in the Mentimeter that was addressing this topic as well, and I don't know, maybe the question came from you. There was someone who suggested that perhaps rather than keep stressing anthelmintic resistance as a negative thing. Farmers are bored with that, and they had antibiotic resistance first, and now people are bashing them with anthelmintic resistance. And someone suggested that in terms of communicating to the farmers, it might be more effective to present a solution, a positive message, like let's try to preserve the efficacy of the anthelmintics for the future.
Yeah, it wasn't me, but I'm glad I'm not the only one out there, Edwin. That's great. But I think, you know, there is this thing that the problem with using the stick is that we know that anthelmintic resistance is an insidious process. So it happens over a period of time. The problem for most sheep, ruminant farmers, is that they don't see it as a problem until they have reached that, if you like, point of no return. And as we saw in the Norwegian paper, where 10% are now starting to feel things aren't so effective. So trying to get people to change when they don't perceive they have the problem is really difficult. But if we can emphasize the benefits in terms of overall management, and they're not just thinking about parasite control, you know, they're not silo thinking about parasite control, they're thinking about and it's not always about profits. Increasingly now in discussions, we're talking about the good farmer concept. So what makes a farmer feel good about what he does? And that means he wants his stock to be healthy. He wants the confidence that what he's doing is going to keep his stock healthy, and he's going to feel at the end of the day, or he or she, have done a good job. So it is taking that wider view to get this behavioural change that we need.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned in your answer the concept of sustainable parasite control, and I would like to ask Katarina Gustafsson, who's working with sheep farmers a lot. Well, we know that sustainability is based on 3 pillars. It's social sustainability, economic, and environmental sustainability. And my question to Katarina Gustafsson would be, what is sustainable parasite control for a farmer? Because does the farmer see sustainable control as the same as we do? Can you please comment on that?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I have talked to, well, first I would like to address that in our country, Sweden, you need a prescription from a vet to use your anthelmintics. And this means, and I think maybe that's, I think it's very good and maybe necessary to have the close dialogue with the sheep farmer. But I asked to form 2 big organizations, and one with the larger farms, the more commercial farms, they would like to emphasize, or they just said that the sustainable parasite control will happen when we can produce lambs without resistant parasites. And this would lead to a good economy and little use of anthelmintics, which is good for the customers and for the environment. And the other organization emphasized that sustainable control is possible when most farmers agree on the same priorities or same strategy. And this needs to include good economy, and it needs to include responsibility from the seller and the buyer, and this will need fecal sampling. And that's also included in this need for a prescription, because if a vet should subscribe the anthelmintics, they need a diagnosis before treatment. So we have lots and lots of diagnostic there's the cat fecal sampling in Sweden, and we have a close communication with the farmers on several times per year discussing these questions.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned economics, and Lesley just told us that we shouldn't see parasite control as a silo, but it should be integrated in whole farm management. And in that context, I have a question for another member of our panel, Ewin Wauters. He's doing a lot of research on farm economics, and I was wondering what he thinks is the role of economics in managing anthelmintic resistance?
Thank you.
Or antimicrobial resistance in general?
Yes, I'm working much more on antimicrobial resistance. I think the role of economics is first conceptually and philosophically, it tells you, which sounds logical, but it tells you that every euro can only be spent once. It's very logical, but it's not, quite often neglected. And economics tells you that cost effectiveness is important. There are many different strategies and policies you can implement to reduce anthelmintic resistance or antimicrobial resistance, and they each have different costs for farmers, for the government, for policymakers, for companies, and they have different effectiveness in terms of reducing the use of antimicrobials and antimicrobial resistance. And well, they should be compared. Just to give an example, I think there is way too many money going to writing brochures and leaflets, etc. While I think that's quite costly to do, and the effectiveness of that is not very high. A second role of economics is that economics is one of the disciplines next to more social sciences, like Fiona presented, that can tell you and help you understand how actors make decisions and what can influence these decisions. And third, also conceptually and philosophically, it's discipline that also tells you that there is more than just communicating innovations to change behavior. There's also economic incentives like taxes or subsidies. There is regulation. There is tools. There is social norms, and they each have different costs and different effectiveness. And economics is kind of the discipline that helps you understand the differences between how effective and how costly these are. And then analytically and methodologically, I think it's quite logical. Economics offers you the tools to evaluate that and to compare the cost effectiveness of different measures. And just one example for antimicrobials, but that is actually quite comparable to climate change and the emission of carbon dioxide is. If you think of all the money that has gone into sense awareness raising and information and trying to change individual behavior, and if you compare that with the possible effectiveness of a tax on carbon or a tax on antimicrobials, I think we forgo several opportunities there to have even bigger effects.
Okay, thanks. So, okay, I can understand that the concept of that €1 can only be spent once, but doesn't that make the story more complicated to the farmer? Because if I understand you correctly, you're telling that, okay, and also Lesley said that, okay, anthelmintic resistance or we have to think positively, improving or preserving anthelmintic efficacy is not a silo. It's related to other management decisions on the farm, because if a farmer decides to treat with anthelmintics, he cannot spend that money elsewhere in his farm management. So there's a competition between sustainable worm control and other farm activities. So we already struggle to get across the concept of sustainable worm control and preserving anthelmintic efficacy on its own. So making the story more complex by putting that into the framework of farm economics and farm management as a whole. How can we manage to get that even more complex story sold to the farmer?
Well,
or to the vet?
The thing is, maybe you don't necessarily need to sell something to the farmer. I think the key is to try to improve production systems, and sustainable worm control has one role to play in that, but there are other aspects as well. And probably if you, in trying to sell something to the farmer, if you focus too much, I actually think that's related to how you communicate these things, the discussion, the previous discussion. If you focus too much on sustainable worm control, maybe that's not a kind of a message that comes across to farmers, and the idea, and that's the economic way to look at a farming system, which is sometimes different than the veterinary way to look at a farming system. We look at the farming system more as a whole, comprised of several subsystems, and we try to improve that. We try to improve how inputs are being transferred into outputs and to reduce bad outputs like bad animal welfare, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And then sustainable worm control has just one role to play in that, besides many others. And yeah, maybe that is a more effective way to improve farming systems as a whole, and then to see what sustainable worm control what kind of role it can have to play in that. And in my view, economics can help you with that, to see the more systemic, to have a more systemic view on a farm or a farming system as a whole.
Okay, thank you. I have a question also for Dave Bartley. So we've been talking about communicating to farmers and behavioral change of the farmers, but is that enough to achieve sustainable parasite control, or do we also need new technological solutions? In other words, do we have the tools in our hands to help the farmers to really apply sustainable worm control, even if they want to?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of the tools, but I would go and agree with Ewin there and Lesley and Katarina. You know, I think it's getting messages across. You know, it's getting the right messages across to the right people in the right formats and the right time. So I think yes, we have the tools there, but I don't think we've necessarily got across how we are going to get farmers to sort of listen to it. And the sort of research that's been going on, I think, you know, that sort of behavioral change is difficult to do. So I think we have the sort of, I think we need to marry sort of all of the stuff that, you know, Fiona and others have spoken about with the sort of technologies that we have available. I think tech in its entirety is very much going to be a part and parcel of it. I mean, you just need to look at how often we use smartphones and all the rest of these things to it as to, you know, how big a part that plays. So I think, you know, targeting treatments and the use of smart farming technologies, I think, is out there. But and I think we, as I say, I think we have a lot of the tools that we need already. I think we need to get those tools used to their advantage. And I think things like the fecal egg count are underutilized, you know, for both monitoring and for testing the efficacy of resistance. So I think we need to use both the old stuff as well as the sort of tech that's there.
Yeah, personally, I agree with you, and I think Ewin would agree with you too, as he presented yesterday the advantages of using fecal egg counts as a monitoring tool, which also fits in a positive story, like monitoring your infection status of your herd can help you to optimize your sustainable worm control and to preserve your anthelmintic efficacy. That doesn't mean that novel tools like to detect anthelmintic resistance using molecular tools wouldn't be useful, of course. I have a question. I'm now looking at the questionnaire box in Mentimeter. A question for all of you, and whoever feels happy to answer, please do. How much impact does animal welfare have in regard to the acceptance or non-acceptance of antiparasitics or sustainable worm control by farmers? So we have been talking about the threat of anthelmintic resistance as an incentive to change their behavior. We have talked about a more positive attitude towards monitoring to change their behavior. Economics are an important factor. But what about animal welfare?
Yeah, I think welfare is a huge part to it. I think, you know, I think all farmers view the welfare and health of their animals as paramount. You know, yes, they are a production system, but, you know, I think, and I think some of the work that you've done, you know, Edwin, you know, the what other people around them think is really important. So I think health and welfare is certainly something that farmers take very important.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. I think, going back to my good farmer concept, I think this is, farmers don't think about welfare, they think about what their animals look like. And that can be a positive or a negative for what we're trying to achieve here. The negative in terms of antimicrobial resistance is there is a tendency for them wanting to use a product, a medicine prophylactically in order to safeguard what they view as the welfare. On the other hand, if they're thinking longer term, which is harder, then they want to preserve the effectiveness of medicines should they need them in the future. So I think that is an important factor, but they're maybe not thinking at it as a welfare thing. It's more about how they feel about their animals, as Dave says.
Yeah, and the more pragmatic farmers think like, if my animals are happy, they also grow better, and it's better for production as well.
Well, but
I also agree with Lesley and Dave, because both the organizations in Sweden, they mentioned that for future possibilities, they wanted always to use something that did not affect the animal health and to have a good animal welfare.
Yeah, Erin, you were about to say something.
Well, the thing is, you could also try to make welfare much more important into the decision making. I think inherently many farmers, they do care about animal welfare, but of course within certain economic conditions, they are a production system. They want to be effective and efficient, and they want to achieve an income. And there are examples known about these quality labels for high welfare meat or high welfare milk products, where farmers get a premium which enables them to take welfare much more into account into their decision making. So it could be through an economic incentive, you could also make welfare more important into the decision making of a farmer.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Looking at Mentimeter, I have a question for Lesley now, which was supported by several people. So according to Fiona's presentation, community influenced the use of diagnostics to inform worm control. How can we as scientists help promote this community influence?
Yeah, I that was really good to see that. I think that is very important. And, in terms of one of the things, how do we communicate? I think community there, this is about confidence. This is about farmers working with other farmers and people that they trust. And so they get that confidence to take on board the new concepts. In fact, just this evening, I've got one group of farmers just like that who've been working together for a while now with a couple of veterinarians and so on. And we're going to get down into a lot of detail tonight about their questions. They're ready now to ask the questions to move on. So I think this is very important, to feel as though you've got that support of like-minded farmers, people who are in the same position as you, but appreciating that you're each probably going to have a slightly different solution. And this is what sustainable control is about. It's not prescriptive anymore. It's about working through it yourself, and you do need that community feel and support.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. I have a question for Edwin now again from one of the Mentimeter. So based on the experience that the veterinary community has with antibiotic resistance for years now, and based on your experience as the coordinator of the Disarm project, how would the experience on antibiotic resistance, how could it help us to manage anthelmintic resistance in the near future?
Well, what we have learned in Disarm and also other projects regarding antimicrobial resistance, the first and very important precondition is that you have a group of stakeholders that you involve, that you talk with them, farmers organizations, individual farmers, government, public agencies, companies. You have to create a certain critical mass of people that regularly sit together and that are doing more than just talking, that are setting milestones, that are really proposing actions and changes to the whole system. And because this will create a critical mass, this will increase awareness, this will increase or this will result in more sensibilization of people. It builds capacities to try to do that. And if we look at across Europe, there are huge differences in the average use of antimicrobials between sectors, and especially between countries, and you see the countries that have succeeded best in reducing antimicrobial use and improving the prudency of antimicrobial use. These are countries that have long ago started such a process, sitting together with stakeholders, also formalizing that in a way. In Belgium, Edwin, we know we have, it's called AMCRA. It's in sort of an institute which is permanent, which is doing that, which facilitates discussion groups, which sets milestones, provides advice, and the countries that have best succeeded, that are now really way below the median, are countries that have done this long ago. So this is a very important first precondition. You have to increase capacities in people and increase or produce a critical mass of awareness in people. And a second is data infrastructure in antimicrobial resistance. In fact, in theory, I'm not a huge fan of the trend to collect much more data. I think data is important, but data on its own doesn't do anything. Data needs to be transformed into information, and that needs to be transformed in advice. But anyway, it seems that in countries where they have a very good monitoring system to monitor antimicrobial use, that actually helps in getting this critical mass together in raising awareness. So that's really at the country level or at the regional level, you need to have something like that, a group of stakeholders supported by good data infrastructure that can regularly sit together and formalize that, not just a voluntary group of people that when they want to sit together, know something institutionalized. And then at the lower level on farms, what has been very, very effective is what in Disarm we are demonstrating, the so-called coaching approach. Just a coach who is not necessarily an expert on antimicrobials or on anything related to that, but who is kind of motivating the farmer, the veterinarian, maybe a feed advisor, others, to sit together, to think about the farm as a whole, to make a whole farm sort of a scan, and then to provide advice, very personalized advice. It is relatively costly, but the effectiveness is really huge. And it's not about disseminating a specific tool or disseminating a specific product. It's about really disseminating in a farm specific way what that farm can do to increase the health and welfare of the animals in a way that uses much less antimicrobials. And that is costly, but very effective. Just as a whole, the cost effectiveness, I think, is much higher than all the efforts to sell a product to farmers or to communicate a certain tool, one particular tool to farmers. That would be at two different levels, and my advice based on Disarm, and that higher level is really a precondition. Without that, the other levels will not happen. So you need to have that critical mass, and we see in many countries we have that, and they are really decreasing a lot, regardless of any products, probiotics, prebiotics. In fact, that doesn't matter. That's just a facilitator. But the majorly important thing has been this critical mass of people.
Okay, thanks. Lesley supported your view on bringing together the stakeholders, and as an example, she gave SCOPS in the UK, in the UK, of course, which we know, and is an example. A question maybe for Dave. So we can try to change farmer behavior and their practice, and to improve their uptake of sustainable worm control. But how do we measure our success? How do we effectively capture data to measure whether in a few years' time or a decade's time we have been successful in changing the farmer's behavior?
Yeah, I think. Thank you for that question.
You can give a pass to any other member of the panel if you like.
No, I mean, I think measuring success, it can be done in multiple ways. I think we can look to see, are we changing practices? So at a very crude level, are we seeing more of uptake of those things that we know are good practice? Albeit I don't necessarily like that term, but things like, are things getting quarantined? Are we seeing better usage of the products? Are we seeing information being taken up? So I think I think there are ways of doing it, and I think questionnaires are probably a crude way of doing it, but it is out there. But I think the other way is, can we see at a level productivity and sustainability within the industries? I mean, I think that's what we're all here for, is to try get the industry, sustainable for the future. So I think that would be the other way of looking at it, is, are we seeing better return on investment at a farm level? So yeah, I think those would be ways of us looking at, are we doing it?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you very much. Katarina, you're working in the field. How do you monitor whether your farmers' worm control is improving in terms of sustainability or not?
We base a lot on the fecal sampling, and since we also have seen a few farms with resistant problems, we are now giving the advice to also start with controlling their treatments, so that if they start with a fecal sample, that leads to a prescription of anthelmintics, and especially if it's a high count and if it's including homunculus, we also give the advice to check after the treatment, did you get the good result you aimed for? So that's one important factor to pick up the farms with possible resistant problems. And if they don't go down to 0 EPG or close to it, we reach out to the farmers and check the dosage and the management, and maybe take it a step further to do resistant FECRT to check for resistance.
Okay, so fecal counts and the number of prescriptions are two important parameters there, if I understand correctly.
But also to check after treatment, did you get the good result?
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you very much, all four of you, to participate in this interesting and lively discussion. But I know that Johannes has prepared a few questions in Mentimeter for all the audience, and I think he probably would like to present the results of those slides at the end of this meeting. Is that correct, Johannes?
Yes, Edwin, that's correct. I think maybe it's useful to show the inputs. Shall I share my screen?
Yes, please. So thank you again, Dave, Lesley, Edwin, and Katarina, for your participation in the discussion, and also thank you all the participants that send in questions to Mentimeter. I cannot thank you personally because it's anonymous, but thank you anyway. So Johannes, please go ahead.
Yes. So the first question, and you can still provide answers. Which policies are needed to address anthelmintic resistance? So we'll go over the comments in more detail later after the meeting. I'll just try to pick out a few of the raised comments. So what I saw was like co-creation also is very important. So together with all the involved parties, especially with farming community, information and formation guidelines for vets, involvement of governments and rules. Yes, so there's many on that, economic incentives and so on. So please, if you have other comments, keep on providing them, and we will try to provide an overall summary in the meeting report. Now I have to find how I have to go to the next slide. Is it easy to find good information regarding sustainable parasite control? We have more or less a balanced situation, with half of the people thinking yes, there is already a lot of information available, while another part thinks not. So it's also during the meeting, I think a lot of comments were raised, like how can we produce, let's say, a single document rather than doing a lot of repetitions. But there was also a comment like maybe it's not, there are enough leaflets and information that there it's more working on the ground and together as a coach with the farmer to make the real change happening. Now, again, sorry, I have to change slides and I'm not sure if it will happen. Yeah, okay. What are your main obstacles to achieve sustainable parasite control? And I'm just reading the biggest words. Complexity is an important one. Lack of diagnosis, I suppose. So lack of uptake or good availability of good diagnostic tools. So there's a cost to it, and who's going to pay that cost? Information, communication, education, these kind of terms. So thank you very much. How can research contribute to better communication strategies? I read multidisciplinary teams, stakeholders, involvement, need simple, clear messages. Do more ring testing of diagnostic tests and so on. So again, please, I think I'm not sure, but I think that the links will stay open even after the meeting. So you may still provide inputs after that.
Okay, thank you all for participating in this Working Group 2 session. Looking forward to see you this afternoon for Working Group 3.